Well, we're dealing with the stories of some of the great missionaries of the church. And the verse that I'll read to you has nothing to do with missions, but it is the life verse of the missionary that we'll talk about this morning. And it's Ephesians chapter 3 and verse number 17. That Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. There are some stories that should never die. There are some men and women that we must never forget. And some of the missionaries that we've talked about over the course of this 2 months are names that we've all heard. C.T. Studd and J. Hudson Taylor and John Patton. Some of them were names that were not familiar with. I was not familiar with James Frazier. I was not familiar with the missionary that we dealt with, that Brother Squires dealt with last week. And it goes to show you that not all of God's heroes are famous men. In Hebrews chapter 11, that faith's hall of fame, there are the names of patriarchs that we all recognize, but then it says, and others, of whom the world was not worthy. And as I have studied the missionaries that I chose to deal with in these hours, I have been struck that there seems to be a common thread that runs through the lives of all great men and women. And there's really two things. One is that their lives were marked by an uncommon devotion to the cause of Christ. These are men and women who were uncommonly consecrated to Christ. They had but one purpose in life, and that was to preach the gospel. And the world really has only known a few men and women who truly counted not their lives dear unto themselves. The second common theme has been that their lives have been marked by incredible suffering for the cause of Christ. It is men and women who have braved hardships and trials like we cannot begin to imagine. And I thought about that earlier this week, that if I come in here every week and we tell you a story of great suffering and hardship and trials and missionaries who suffered greatly in body and died at a young age, that may be more depressing than inspiring. Who wants to sign up for that? But the consecrated life is not a call to a life of ease. Christ calls for us to take up our cross and to follow Him. There is nothing about a cross that conjures up thoughts of comfort. So uncommon consecration, incredible suffering, great sacrifice. And that really sums up the story of Adoniram Judson. You've heard the name before. There are several reasons why Adoniram Judson stands out at the top of the list of missionaries from America. For one thing, Adoniram Judson was the first American missionary to move to a foreign field for the purpose of preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. He would spend his life in Burma for nearly 40 years. He would face great persecution, great hardship. But he would leave a Bible translated in the Burmese language. He would leave thousands of converts after his work was done. He was born in 1788 in Malden, Massachusetts. His father was a devout Congregationalist preacher. He was raised in a very devout home. His parents had hoped that he would follow his father in ministry. And Judson was somewhat of a prodigy at an early age. He learned to read at the age of 3. He was always at the head of his class at school. He learned Greek at the age of 12. He entered in what is now called Brown University at the age of 16. He graduated at 19 as valedictorian of his class. Later, as a missionary, he would master the Burmese language, which is one of the most difficult languages to learn. But he mastered it so that the Burmese would say that he spoke like a native. But his intellect really became more of a curse than that of a blessing, because that's eventually what led him away from the Lord. That he was raised in a very devout home. He had worldly aspirations. His parents had hoped that he would follow in his father's footsteps in the ministry, but Adoniram showed no interest in serving the Lord. After he graduated from college, he came back home. He started an elementary school for girls, wrote several textbooks for English grammar and mathematics. But teaching school was not challenging. It was not enough for an ambitious, restless soul. And so he decided that he would become an actor. And his parents, of course, were heartbroken when he announced to them that he was going to move to New York to pursue a career in theater. That was the worldly ambition that drove Adoniram Judson. His father tried to get him to consider preaching. It only made Adoniram angry. It drove a wedge between he and his parents. When he got to college, there was another young man that plays a very important role in his life, and that man is Jacob Eames. In the early 19th century, French infidelism was sweeping across America. There were names like Voltaire and Thomas Paine that were speaking and writing, and their books were literally very influential on the minds of many young people. Students at universities like Yale and Providence College, which is now Brown University, they were reading Age of Reason and Common Sense, all written by Thomas Paine. And in fact, it was a fad back then for a lot of university students to call themselves by the name of their favorite infidel. Thomas Paine, Voltaire. Adoniram Judson was already a skeptic of his father's faith. And when he entered into that climate in that college, it fed the skepticism until he became a full-blown atheist. He became close friends with a young man who was a year older than he was, Jacob Eames. Eames was a brilliant young man. He had wit and clever ways that appealed to Adoniram, and the two developed a very close friendship. Eames was a very openly atheistic man. And by the time that Adoniram Judson graduated from college and went back home, he had renounced anything to do with Christianity. You can imagine the pain that caused his father, that Congregationalist preacher. But his father was a simple, uneducated man. He couldn't match the wits of his son. But while his father had no answer for Adoniram's sophisticated reasoning skepticism, Adoniram had no answer for his mother's tears and mother's prayers. Adoniram Judson tried his hand at acting for a while. He was restless. And so Adoniram joined a traveling group of singers, musicians, kind of a hippie kind of band, for several weeks to play what he called a wild, reckless life. I imagine it in my mind as traveling hippies. But after a few weeks of it, it just wasn't enough. And so Adoniram struck off on his own by horseback just to wander through the countryside. And on one historic night, he stopped at an inn to spend the night, and there was only one room available. And the innkeeper was apologetic and didn't want him to rent him the room. He said in the room next to that open room, there's a young man that's been there for a couple of days, and he's dying. He's very sick. He's moaning, he's groaning. I know that if I put you in the room adjoining to him, that those moans throughout the night is going to keep you up. I don't want to put you that close to death. And Adoniram Judson said, I'll take the room. And he even boasted, he said, death has no terrors for me. I'm an atheist. And throughout the night, he listens to the man in the adjoining room moaning in the throes of death, and the cries get weaker as the night wears on. And that night, Adoniram could hardly sleep. And he kept thinking, I wonder if he's prepared to die. I wonder where he is going to spend eternity. And then Adoniram would chide himself. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in that. And he would try to get his thoughts back. And the next morning, Adoniram got ready to leave. And he asked the innkeeper, he said, hey, what about the young man next door that was sick? And he said, oh, he died early this morning. Adoniram Judson said, you don't by any chance know who he was? And the innkeeper said, yeah, he was a recent graduate from Providence College. His name was Jacob Eames, his close friend. The man who had led him into skepticism and atheism. He had not known that it was his close friend, the man who had mentored him in his unbelief, that had died in the room next to him that night. And as you can imagine, that shook Adoniram Judson. Adoniram Judson went home. he decided that he would enter Andover Theological Seminary and study for the ministry. At this time, he wasn't even saved. He went to seminary and began to read the writings of a Puritan writer named Thomas Boston. And through the writings of Thomas Boston, at the age of 20, Adoniram Judson got saved. When Adoniram Judson got saved, God immediately began to burden his heart for missions. Because he was a college graduate, because he was a smart young man, there was a very prominent, a very fashionable church in Boston that offered him a position as an assistant pastor. But Adoniram Judson wrote, he said, "My work is not here. God is calling me beyond the seas. To stay here, even to serve God in this ministry, I feel would be only partial obedience, and I could not be happy in that." His mother, his sister, begged him to take the position. He said, "God's not calling me there. God's calling me across the sea." Here is the problem. In the early 1800s, there was no foreign missionaries that had ever been sent out of any church in America. There were no mission boards. There were no missionary societies. It all had simply never been done. But the burden only got stronger. He wrote in a magazine in 1811, he said, "How do Christians discharge this trust committed to them? They let 3/4 of the world sleep the sleep of death, ignorant of the simple truth that a Savior died for them, content if they can be useful in the little circle of their acquaintances. They quietly sit and see whole nations perish for lack of knowledge." So Adoniram and a few friends got together and began to have prayer meetings every week for this matter of missions. They would call it the haystack prayer meeting because they would meet at a haystack. And that haystack is really the birthplace of missions in America. So Judson and 3 of his friends, they approached the Congregational Ministerial Association and asked if they would form a society and send them to the mission field. So in 1810, the General Association of Congregational Ministers of Bradford, Massachusetts, organized the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. That is the first mission board started in America, and those 4 men were the first men approved as missionaries to the Far East. The day after, those 4 young men were invited to dinner at a deacon's house in that Congregationalist church. And that is where Adoniram Judson met Nancy Hasseltine. Her name was Ann Hasseltine. Her nickname was Nancy, but her name was Ann Hasseltine. It was a very short courtship. Adoniram was making plans to leave for India. He didn't know what kind of life that he could offer his wife, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Normally, when you ask a young lady to marry her, you first try to convince her how wonderful her life will be if she just says yes. Adoniram knew that he couldn't promise her anything but hardship and trials. So about a month after they began courting, her father gets a letter from Adoniram Judson. If you have a daughter, imagine getting this letter. "I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world, whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death." But then he said, "Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God?" Anne was a godly lady. She wanted nothing more than for her life to be spent for Jesus. So with her eyes wide open to the dangers of the mission field, Anne said yes. February 1812, pivotal month. Within 1 month, Adoniram Judson was married to Anne, ordained the next day, commissioned as a foreign missionary, and set sail for Calcutta, India, 13 days later. Along with Samuel and Harriet Newell, Adoniram and Ann Judson would be the first Americans to choose to move to a foreign nation for the sole purpose of spreading the gospel to unreached people. Adoniram Judson sent to part with yours of age. To get to India from America in the 1800s, obviously you had to go by sea. It was a 4-month journey. So they left on February 19, 1812. They would not arrive in Calcutta until June 17 of that year, 114 days at sea. But during those 4 months, there was something else that happened with the Jordans that would change every plan that they had planned as congregational missionaries. Congregationalists, you may not know what that is. Congregationalists trace their heritage back to the Puritans who left the Church of England, left England, and came over here to America for religious liberties. So in the early colonial days of America, the Congregational church was really one of the more prominent denominations in America. And probably the biggest difference between Congregationalist and Baptist is over baptism. Baptists practice believers-only baptism. It is only after you have been saved that you are a candidate for baptism. Congregationalists practice infant baptism. They will baptize infants. If you get saved later in life, they do not insist on rebaptism. The Judsons were Congregationalists, but there were no other Congregationalist missionaries to work with. So they're going to India, and they're going to meet a group of Baptist missionaries who were led by none other than William Carey. They were going to try to join that group. A Congregationalist who believed in infant baptism to work with Baptists who do not believe in infant baptism. How's this going to work? So Adoniram Judson devoted himself during that 4-month voyage to study the doctrine of baptism in preparation of having answers for the Baptist side of the matter. He wasn't going to go unprepared. And remember, he's a very educated man. He's a very intelligent man. He knew that all of his converts would be adults, but should they baptize the children of those converts? He knew that he would work alongside of Baptists so that don't believe like he does, and so he's got to study the issue and shore up what he believes. But how many of you know that if you study the Bible with an open mind and an honest heart, it doesn't reinforce your error, it leads you into truth? By the time that Judson arrived in Calcutta, he and his wife both were convinced that infant baptism has no merit in the Word of God, and that the Baptist belief of believers-only baptism is the correct biblical position. They left as Congregationalists. By the time they got to India, in their heart they were Baptist. When they got to India, Judson wrote a letter to William Carey. He said, feeling that we are in an unbaptized state, we wish to profess our faith in Christ by being baptized in obedience to His sacred commands. So in September of that year, Adoniram and Ann Judson were baptized by an associate of William Carey's and became Baptist missionaries. The problem is that they have been sent by a Congregationalist mission society, and they are supported by Congregationalist churches to start Congregationalist churches that preach congregational doctrine, but they were no longer that. Anne wrote a letter to a close friend, said, "My dear Nancy, we are confirmed Baptists, not because we wish to be, but because truth compelled us to be. We anticipate the loss of reputation and of the affection and esteem of many of our American friends." And Adoniram Judson knew it would not be right to continue to be supported by Congregationalist church. So he resigned as their missionary, which meant he also cut himself off from any financial support that would be coming. One of their close friends was a man named Luther Rice. Luther Rice actually came a couple of months after them. He did the same thing, studying baptism, came to the same conclusion as the Judsons has, and he became a Baptist. So Luther Rice and the Judsons decided it would be better for Luther Rice to turn around, go back to America, and try to encourage Baptist churches to send support. And that led to the first Baptist missionary society being started in America. And the Judsons were the first missionaries out of America to be sent by a Congregationalist church, but they were also the first missionaries out of America to be sent by a Baptist church. The Judsons' plan to start a work in India was immediately derailed when they were denied permanent status in India. The British did not want American missionaries evangelizing Hindus because they were afraid it would upend the trade that they had with India, and so they kicked all American missionaries out of the country. And when they were denied resident status in India, they knew that they couldn't build a work on a short amount of time, so they began looking for another place, and the place they decided on was Burma. Burma was closed to the gospel and to the outside world. It was ruled by a tyrant. It was horribly hot. It was disease-ridden. The religion was Buddhism. The government was corrupt. There was no tolerance for any other religion. Torture and executions were common. It is hard to imagine they could have found a worse place than Burma, which is why William Carey himself said, "Don't go to Burma." William Carey's son, Felix, wrote of Burma. He said, "The houses were miserably built. The streets were filthy with vermin. The rents wickedly oppressive. The taxes absurdly high. And the punishment was barbarous." On July 13, 1813, the Judsons landed in Rangoon, Burma. The first thing that a missionary has to do when he gets to a foreign field is he has to learn the language. The Burmese language happens to be one of the most difficult languages to learn. Adoniram Judson was fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew. It would take him 3 years of studying 12 hours a day with a tutor to master Burmese. For those 3 years, they had virtually no contact from anybody in America. They were completely cut out from the outside world. Burma was so close to the gospel, Burma was so hostile to the government that it would take 4 years before Judson would ever have a public service. And eventually, he built a little bamboo shelter outside of his house. It was customary in Burma to have a little reception area outside of your house before you came into the house. He built a little bamboo shelter out next to the road, out against his house, and he began to have a Bible studies out there. His first Bible study, 15 men came. They were just curious. They had no interest in what he was saying. And Adoniram and Ann Judson would sit out there and they would have Bible studies. It would be 6 years before they'd have their first convert. Missionaries write letters all the time back to the States, and they give reports, and we read the letters and we see what they're doing to determine if they're still worthy of support. Can you imagine getting letters for 6 years and nobody is saved? In fact, the mission society that was supporting him, somebody wrote him a letter after a couple of years with nothing happening, no fruit, and said, "Hey, what really are the prospects of missions in Burma?" And Judson wrote a letter back, and in that letter he said, "The prospects are as bright as the promises of God." He began translation work in addition to his public ministry. He translated a grammar for the Burmese language. It is still in use today. He began translating the Bible. In 1817, another American missionary came to Burma with a printing press. 800 copies of Judson's translation of Matthew was printed. That was the first printed material ever printed in the country of Burma. At their 10-year mark, 1823, they had been in Burma for 10 years. They had 22 converts. And Judson had translated the entire New Testament into the Burmese language. In 1824, war broke out between the British and Burma. And for sake of time, I'll not go into the history of that war, but Burma suspected all American and British missionaries to be spies and began arresting them. So one night, police broke into Judson's home, drug him out of bed, threw him to the ground, tied his hands behind his back, and drug him to one of the most infamous prisons in the world at Ava, Burma. And for the next 19 months, Adoniram would suffer some of the worst torments that can possibly be described. He would actually be in 2 prisons. One of the prisons was literally overseen by convicted murderers who had been spared death sentences in exchange for guarding the prison. He would be bound with 3 pairs of chains. His feet would be fastened in stocks, sometimes elevated so only his shoulders touched the ground. He was placed in a single room with no windows, 100 men. Stifling heat, unbearable stench, rats, rodents crawling all over the place. They had one jailer they called Mr. Spotted Face. Mr. Spotted Face liked to play a statistic game every day. He would come out, he would ring a gong at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He He would go into the prison's quarters. He would select one prisoner to be executed, take him out, and execute him. And every day you lived wondering if today is the day you're the one selected to die. Anne would visit Adoniram while in prison. It was really her courage that kept him alive. She would bribe the jailer so she could slip him some food. She would sneak to the door of the cell under the cover of darkness and whisper words of encouragements. The prison guards had captured a lion. They had it in a cage. They were starving it. The plan was to turn it loose on some of the prisoners. And the lion died before they could do that, and Anne was able to convince the guards to let her clean the cage out and put Adoniram in that cage for a couple of weeks so she could nurse him back to health. Bear in mind that Anne had had her first miscarriage on their voyage from India to Burma. A few years later, she had her second child. She buried him at 8 months of age. Their third child was born while Adoniram was in prison. Smallpox was ravaging the country. Anne had smallpox. She was deathly sick. She's trying to care for her husband in prison. She had 2 orphaned Burmese girls that she's trying to raise, and her baby is sick. Anne didn't have any money. She's sick. She couldn't nurse her baby. Anne would walk the streets of that town and beg women to give her milk for her baby. One of the most heart-wrenching pages in the history of Christian missions is when Adoniram Judson was released from prison. Anne had not been there to see him for several weeks. He wondered if she was even still alive. And he stumbled down the road to the mission house, and when he walked in, the first thing that he saw was a fat, half-naked Burmese woman sitting on a dirt floor holding a baby. And the baby was so filthy and so malnourished, he didn't recognize it, didn't think it could possibly be his baby. And next to her on a bed was a body that was so ghastly pale and emaciated, he did not recognize it as his wife, Anne. That girl who had said yes, who had followed him to India and then to Burma, who had already lost 2 children, who had kept him alive during his prison tortures, who had been denied all the comforts of the world to try to reach a people that didn't want them there. And Anne would suffer for a few more months, and then she'd finally be freed from a broken body, and God called her home. Anne was 37 years of age. 6 months after she dies, she's joined by their third child. The story of Anne Judson is a remarkable story. We don't have time to tell it. She's the first missionary to translate any scripture into Siamese. She did much to improve the lot of women in Burma. One of the more common stories told about Adoniram Judson is how that he sank into deep depression after Anne died. 3 months after Anne dies, he gets word that his father in the States had died. When Adoniram Judson left the States at the age of 25, he would never see his mother, his father, his brother again. He couldn't know that. And so when Adoniram gets word that his father has died, Anne has died, he cuts himself off from all outside acquaintances. He destroys a lot of letters. He returns an honorary doctorate degree from Brown University. And he goes into a jungle and he builds a little hut to live in that little hut. And for 40 days, he lived in that hut, contemplating his calling and even suicide. He dug his own grave next to the hut. Every day he would go out and he would sit next to that grave for days, contemplating what would it be like to die. It was the year 1830. Finally, he comes out of the jungle with a new life, and that becomes the turning point of his ministry. Ironically, the greatest work that Judson would do was not among the Burmese people, it was among the Karen tribe. The Karen tribe was a very primitive tribe in the southern regions of Burma. And Judson met a man, his name was Kotai Bu, and I'm probably messing the word up, but Kotai Bu was a criminal. He was being sold as a slave for debts. And Judson purchased him. And then Judson set him free. And then Judson led him to the Lord. And this former slave, this former thief, this man who claimed to have murdered 30 people, became evangelist to his own people. And he went back to his tribe and he began preaching the gospel. And Judson began taking trips back and forth into that region. And within 25 years, there would be 11,000 baptized believers among the Karen tribe. The story has to end. Judson's most enduring work was translating the Bible into the Burmese language. After 24 years of translating, he completed the Bible in 1834. The next year, 1835, he married his second wife, the widow of a fellow missionary. Her name was Sarah. Over the course of their marriage, they would have 8 children. 5 of them would survive to adulthood. They enjoyed 8 years of fruitful ministry together, and then her health began to fail, and they decided that she needed to sail back to America in order for her to recuperate. So in 1845, Adoniram and Sarah Judson sailed back to the States. It is Adoniram's first trip back to the States in 34 years. They left their 3 youngest children back in Burma. One of them would die before they'd make it back to Burma. In fact, Sarah wouldn't make it all the way. She would die en route on the voyage. When Judson arrived in the States, he was surprised to find he was greeted as a celebrity. His first wife, Anne, had written a book. It had been published in America detailing some of the exploits that they had in Burma. And the stories of that work on the mission field it became wide known in America, and everybody wanted to see the great pioneer missionary. So he spent about a year traveling to churches along the eastern shoreboard. He was so weak in his body from abuse on the mission field that he could barely speak above a whisper. So when Adoniram Judson came back and began preaching in these churches, he had to have an assistant standing next to him, and he would speak to the assistant, and the assistant would relay it to the congregation. One of those meetings, somebody came to hear the great Adoniram Judson, and they left complaining because he didn't tell about enough adventures in Burma. They told Judson, and Judson said, "I am glad. They have it to say that I had nothing better to tell than the wondrous story of Jesus' dying love." In 1846, Judson comes back to Burma to continue the work. His body is so broken, he'll never have health again. He develops a serious lung disease. Doctors thought a sea voyage, breathing sea air, might help him. He was so sick he couldn't walk. Men from the church put him on a stretcher. They carried him aboard the ship, weeping. Surely this sea voyage will help him. And how little did they know that it would help him. Because on April 12, 1850, 9 days into the voyage, Adoniram Judson died. The captain of the ship ordered the ship to stop. They put Adoniram's body in a pine coffin. The captain ordered it lowered across, and Judson was buried at sea. He was 62 years old. He had spent 38 years in Burma with 1 trip back to America in those 38 years. What did he leave? He left a Burmese Bible that is still being used today. He left a Burmese English dictionary. Every grammar and every dictionary written in Burma in the last 150 years has been based on the work of Adoniram Judson. What did he leave? 63 churches, 123 missionaries and pastors, over 8,000 believers. At the 100th anniversary of his death, the government of Burma, which is now Myanmar, conducted a survey, recorded 210,000 people who claim Christianity. Today, there are some 3,700 Baptist churches in Burma. And every July, they celebrate Adoniram Judson Day. Burma, today is in the top 10 nations of nations who claim Baptists as a percentage of their population. It all started with Adoniram Judson. When I went through this story and I read the biographies and studied this, my heart was moved. And there was a song, Sister Marcy, I want you to come. There was a song that kept coming to my mind. I wonder, have I done my best for Jesus? To have a life that is spent for Him.